how to work effectively with professional interpreters in education. We are pleased to offer you this guide to work effectively with trained educational interpreters in order to create linguistic and cultural bridges with your English learner families. We will be covering key issues that will help ensure you get the most out of your collaboration with a trained educational interpreter. What is a trained and qualified educational interpreter? Trained and qualified educational interpreters have received specialized training to accurately relay complex school terminology. Medical, legal, and community interpreters may not have been exposed to the vocabulary and procedures pertaining to meetings such as disciplinary hearings, individualized education plans, retention and promotion placement meetings, and more, and may need additional training and experience to support you with communication in a school setting. Do professional interpreters in education have a code of ethics? Absolutely. Professional interpreters in education are trained to apply high standards of competence and professional conduct wherever they work. Professional interpreters in education pledge to uphold their code of ethics, maintaining strict confidentiality in all matters pertaining to an interpreted meeting, rendering an interpretation faithfully without additions, omissions, or alterations to the message, rejecting personal bias or opinions that affect accuracy, disclosing any real or perceived conflict of interest before supporting school personnel with interpretation, and much more. But the parents at my school want to bring their family members and friends to interpret. What is wrong with that? Family and friends should not take the place of professional interpreters because they may be emotionally involved with the English learner and lack impartiality. Unlike trained educational interpreters, informal interpreters or interpreters trained in other fields are not bound by a code of ethics specific to educational interpreters and may indeed cause time-consuming problems by misinterpreting key information and build cultural barriers instead of bridges. While it is never advisable to allow family members to interpret, this is especially true if the interpreter is a child. Children often do not have the language skills necessary to interpret and may be inclined to omit or edit information that is crucial for parents to hear. In addition, when acting as interpreters, children are placed in an awkward and stressful situation which may disrupt family roles. And what else do I need to know about educational interpreters? Professional interpreters in education should not interpret word by word, but rather concept by concept. Meanings of words and phrases can differ across cultures, and in some languages there may be no linguistic or conceptual equivalent to an English word or term. In these cases, the interpreter may need to describe the concept or ask you to provide examples to support the explanation. This is why it may seem to take forever to interpret a short comment in English. Educational interpreters are trained to interpret everything that is said by both parties, including inappropriate remarks, obscene language, and side comments made to the interpreter. All parties should avoid saying anything they do not want others to hear. In the event that the interpreter converses directly with one or the other party to clarify a point, the interpreter will explain the content of this side discussion to the other person. It is important to remember that English learners can often understand more English than they can speak. Unofficial comments such as, "Now don't interpret this," but may be understood by the English learner and will be interpreted by a trained educational interpreter. During the course of a session, the educational interpreter may become aware that communication has broken down because of a culture-related misunderstanding. When this happens, the interpreter will intervene and explain the problem to both parties before attempting to broker mutual understanding. Keep in mind that an interpreter who speaks the same language as the English learner may not share the same cultural heritage and may not be able to speak with authority about cultural practices. The professional interpreter in education may also intervene in specific instances, such as when the parties are speaking too quickly, they are not pausing to allow the interpreter to relay the information, or when clarification is needed. If all parties are speaking at the same time, a professional interpreter must intervene and ask parties to speak one at a time so that information can be relayed accurately. And what do I do if a parent refuses an interpreter? English learners may refuse an interpreter for a number of reasons, including confidentiality concerns and issues surrounding an interpreter's gender, religion, or ethnic background. Sometimes English learners also feel that their English skills are sufficiently good to do without an interpreter. If an educational institution feels that the English learner needs an interpreter, let the English learner know that the educational interpreter is thoroughly trained and has a code of ethics that includes confidentiality and impartiality. You may also want to add that the interpreter can provide a backup service and will interject only if problems arise with communication if the English learner feels that their English skills are sufficient. Explain that you will still need the educational interpreter present to ensure your own understanding. I'm ready to schedule an interpreter for my next meeting. Now what? Before arranging for an on-site interpreter, please ensure that you know which language or dialect the English learner speaks. Keep in mind that there are over 22 countries where Spanish is spoken, and there are some variations in the language from country to country and many times within the same country. For example, Guatemala has 24 languages, 22 of which are Mayan, so not all families from Guatemala may need a Spanish language interpreter. India has over 65 different languages, one of them being English. And there are 26 countries where Arabic is the official language of the government, with Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan having the highest number of Arabic speakers. There are almost 2.5 million ethnic Chinese living in Vietnam, and most do not speak Vietnamese. Lastly, while speakers of Cantonese and Mandarin cannot understand each other when they speak, their written languages are identical. What else can I do to ensure a successful interpretation? It is important to remember that you are in control of the meeting. It is your job, not the interpreter's, to control the proceedings, clarify jargon and abbreviations, verify understanding, and respond to questions. Speak to the educational interpreter before the meeting starts to establish rapport and talk about some of the terminology that may be presented. Keep in mind that educational interpreters can only accommodate one speaker at a time, and the interpreter may intervene if meeting participants are speaking over each other. A meeting with an interpreter will take longer. The amount of extra time needed will be influenced by the structures and complexities of the other language. While English is a low-context, direct language with economical word usage, higher context languages need more words to say the same thing. Therefore, it may seem that your interpreter is spending much more time relaying your message than she or he does the reverse. The educational interpreter needs to be able to interact with both parties without disrupting the flow of dialogue. Speak to the English learner rather than the interpreter so that you can build rapport, which will result in a more natural flow of information. Remember, it is helpful to speak to the interpreter prior to the meeting about the purpose of the meeting, any complex concepts or terminology that may come up, any sensitive issues that you feel need to be shared with the interpreter to aid in understanding the purpose of the meeting, and any materials or forms that may need to be read to the English learner in her or his native language. Speaking of forms, interpreters can read short paragraphs of information to English learners in their native language. However, you must always be present while the educational interpreter does so, in case the English learner has questions about the content. This will prevent the English learner from asking questions directly to the interpreter instead of you. Anything else I should remember? Insist that educational interpreters introduce themselves to all the parties involved, including the English learner, and reassure that accuracy, impartiality, and confidentiality are maintained. The professional interpreter in education should remind all parties to speak to each other and not the interpreter. Clarify that he or she will need time to repeat everything said. Explain that everything heard will be interpreted, and remind all parties that the interpreter will intervene if clarification is needed. It is very helpful to interpreters if you speak in layman's terms, make one point at a time, and frame questions so that they are easy to interpret. If technical terms cannot be avoided, please explain their meanings to the interpreter. Use of examples, visual aids, and spelling out acronyms and abbreviations will help with communication. Remember to pause at the end of every 2 to 3 sentences, but avoid breaking up a thought as the interpreter is listening for meaning and context. Give the interpreter enough time to process your information and to convey it to the English learner before jumping in with more information or questions. Verify the English learner's understanding by checking at regular intervals to make sure that you and the English learner have understood one another fully and well. Look for signs of comprehension, confusion, agreement, or disagreement. For example, you can either ask the English learner directly if everything is clearly understood, or ask open-ended questions to elicit understanding. You can also ask the English learner to repeat back their version of what has been said or summarize the main points of the discussion. At the end of the interpretation, summarize decisions, list instructions, and ensure that the English learner has had the opportunity to ask any questions or make any necessary comments or contributions. After the meeting, take the time to provide your interpreter with feedback and clarify any cultural issues or terminology that may have come up. This will help the educational interpreter do a better job in the future. What about phone interpreters? As a general guide, on-site interpretation should be used in circumstances where complex matters need to be discussed or important decisions need to be made. For example, unless circumstances allow no other alternative, a phone interpreter should not be used during student disciplinary hearings, meetings involving special education decisions, or when the English learner is under emotional, physical, or mental stress. While on-site interpreting offers a more personal service and ensures a fuller understanding of the subject discussed, telephone interpreting is useful in situations where a person needs immediate assistance or where an on-site interpreter who speaks a particular language is not available. And what if my meeting involves special education services? It is imperative that schools only use interpreters with specialized training to handle the complex vocabulary and proceedings pertinent to the special education field. Professional interpreters in education are trained to identify cultural situations in special education where misunderstandings may arise and where their cultural knowledge may be needed to ensure accurate communication. If a student has to be assessed in his or her native language by a school psychologist, speech pathologist, or other professionals to determine eligibility for special education services, it is essential that you ask the assistance of an interpreter that has received specialized training to conduct these evaluations in the educational setting. A medical, legal, or community interpreter with no training in the educational field may invalidate standard scores to qualify a child for special education, negatively affect family engagement efforts, and contribute to the anxiety that families of children with special needs already feel when they come to a school setting. Thank you for taking the time to review this information. If you have any questions about specialized training for bilingual school personnel, skill-building opportunities for professional interpreters in education, or quality interpretation and translation services, please feel free to reach us at sesoincga@gmail.com.